The sleek glass lobby of Sterling Dominion went dead quiet when a man in worn-out flannel walked inside, holding a battered leather case close under his arm. Amelia Whitmore, the young CEO, was famous for her icy, calculated composure. She judged his dusty work boots instantly, laughing right in front of the shareholders. "People like you do not belong here." She only saw the cheap clothes, assuming he was a handyman begging for work. He simply turned around to leave. But then the chairman stepped off the elevator, walked right up, and warmly shook his hand. Amelia's smug smile froze instantly. Late autumn in Charleston brought a tired golden light that drifted low across the harbor, casting long shadows over the old warehouses. For nearly 10 years, Graham Cole lived quietly within that light inside a narrow brick building, just a few blocks from the waterfront. He ran a modest print shop there, copying dusty construction blueprints for local builders and land surveyors. He kept his working hours quiet and left the front window dusty and unwashed. You see, most people who walked through his door never even asked his name. He liked it that way. In his experience, a name was just something others used to judge your value. But there was a time when his name carried immense weight in the city. Years ago, before the long silence. Before worn flannel replaced his expensive custom-tailored suits. Graham had actually been the brilliant lead architect behind Sterling Tower. That towering glass spire rising over the financial district, which became the proud face of Sterling Dominion. He designed those sleek lines during endless nights, believing great architecture could capture a truly human soul. Then, his beloved wife passed away suddenly and without warning. With her, the part of him that cared about status and recognition died too. He walked away from his prestigious firm and the glittering awards. He left the rooms of endless applause behind, never explaining his choice to a single soul. He found comfort knowing his simple work today was honest and real. He measured paper, printed blueprints, handed over roll-down drawings, and quietly accepted their cash payments. It was simple, honest, and clean. This new life asked nothing of him but his hands. He grew content being invisible, so much so that he often forgot the massive skyscraper downtown still carried his personal fingerprints in its steel bones. Amelia Whitmore had no such peace, nor did she ever want it. At 34, she was named the youngest chief executive of the Southern Division in the company's entire history. She wore that powerful corporate title like heavy armor she was afraid to take off. Arriving at the office before 6 each morning, she only left long after the cleaning crews. She learned early on that if people spot even a hint of softness in you, they will take everything. She possessed a sharp, calculating intelligence. It was the relentless grit of someone who clawed her way to the very top. The board members loved her profits but deeply feared her raw hunger. She could feel their quiet hostility in every single meeting. In every judgmental glance that lingered just a second too long on her designer clothes. Her background, her accent, and how she carried herself at mandatory corporate dinners. So she dressed sharper than them all, speaking faster to survive. She made sure nobody ever saw her look weak. Most mornings her least trusted advisor stood the closest. Richard Vail had run operations there for 19 years, long enough to believe the entire division belonged to him by inheritance. When Amelia took over, he quietly expected her failure. He never protested, he just smiled and offered congratulations. With the patience of a man who had outlasted 3 bosses, he began showing her how things were done. His poison sounded like wisdom, dividing the wealthy families from those he deemed worthless. He told her that the company's image was a delicate thing easily ruined by associating with the wrong crowd. He spoke constantly of standards and outward appearances, drawing a sharp line between those who build the world and those who just clean it. Amelia, who grew up on the wrong side of that very line, accepted it all, never realizing how perfectly it fed her deepest, oldest fears. The chairman observed everything quietly from a distance. Leonard Sterling was past 70 now and rarely visited their southern offices. But when he did visit, he watched people, not spreadsheets. He had built the company on the firm belief that a business is only as decent as how it treats those who can offer nothing. And he was growing deeply concerned about what this division was becoming. He had chosen Amelia despite Richard's loud objections. Now he was still waiting to see if he was right. Let's look at the morning. Everything changed with a call to Graham's shop. A young coordinator from the firm desperately needed a full set of original historical blueprints delivered downtown before noon, right before a massive investment deal. These files were stored in Graham's workshop because he was the original architect who drew them, and nobody had ever picked them up. He hated the errand, but the new project directly affected the harbor he loved. So he carefully packed up his worn leather case, threw on a warm flannel against the cold wind, and drove the short distance into a financial district he had not entered in years. He entered through the grand front doors, having forgotten after so many years that men, wearing simple clothes, were expected to use the back alley. The soaring lobby looked exactly as he remembered it. The sunlight streamed through the high glass at the exact angle he designed decades earlier. For one quiet moment he stood frozen in the heart of his own creation. Unknowingly, he had arrived at the absolute worst time. The wealthy shareholders, the media, and rows of expensive suits were all there. Everyone was posing for the cameras to celebrate the massive deal. Amelia stood right at the center of the crowd, looking absolutely flawless in the defining moment of her hard-fought career. And then, in walked a simple man in heavy work boots carrying a worn case, looking completely out of place on the polished marble floors. She noticed his dusty boots first, then the cheap flannel, the rough jaw, and the beat-up case held by old straps. With one look, she dismissed him as a simple laborer, ignoring the genius standing right before her. He looked like a simple worker, easily dismissed by his clothes. Immediately, the wealthy elite judged him solely by his jacket. Amelia felt her beautifully polished morning starting to fall apart at the edges. She panicked, terrified of being linked to someone who looked so basic. So she did exactly what she was trained to do. She stopped him quickly, snapping, "People like you don't belong here." Her voice carried clearly across the room, smooth and final. "Use the service entrance around the side. Someone will help you there." Graham just looked at her calmly, refusing to get angry. He had sacrificed too much to ever care about the approval or judgment of rooms like this. He simply nodded, the quiet gesture of a man who knew his own worth. He calmly walked toward the dark side corridor, carrying his work under his arm. The lobby relaxed. Amelia flashed a highly rehearsed smile to the crowd, trying to salvage the moment. Right then, the private elevator opened and the legendary Leonard Sterling stepped out. Nobody expected him there. He walked slowly across the cold marble, leaning on a cane he used mostly for dramatic effect, as the entire room shifted around his old power. The investors stood tall. Richard rushed over from the windows, eager to welcome the billionaire. But Leonard completely ignored the crowd of wealthy elite. He marched past the shareholders, past the cameras, ignoring Amelia completely. He walked straight to the simple father in flannel, who was almost at the exit. "Graham," the founder called out, his deep voice cutting through the silence. "My God, it has been too long." He grabbed Graham's hand warmly in both of his. This was not some cold corporate handshake. It was how you greet a true brother. Someone you and I have spent years hoping to find again. "I am sorry," Leonard said, raising his voice so the whole room could hear. His warm eyes suddenly turned razor sharp. "I am deeply sorry you had to enter your own skyscraper through the back." You and I can see the shock as the snobbish investors stared at each other. A nearby journalist raised her phone, and Amelia froze. She stood there, completely stripped of her superficial arrogance, as her entire proud world collapsed right beneath her feet. "This man," Leonard announced, keeping his hand on Graham's shoulder, "designed the entire masterpiece we are standing in right now. Every beautiful line in this lobby, and how the morning light hits it. The reason you feel so inspired when you walk through these doors. That was him, Graham Cole. I have been begging him to return to our firm for 10 years. Dead silence, the fake smile was still glued to Amelia's face, but it had frozen into a hard, brittle mask of utter public embarrassment. She looked incredibly small and naive, showing everyone in the room just how young, foolish, and shallow she truly was. Graham did not crush her pride, though he easily could have. You never know what a person has sacrificed. And right then, the tables could have turned, exposing the young woman who judged him as the morning's true villain. Instead, he just shook Leonard's hand, saying it was great to see him. He quietly set his leather case on the reception desk where those drawings belonged. Then he stepped back, quiet, refusing to become a weapon. But the damage was done, and she knew it. She finished the contract signing in a fog, forcing smiles for the cameras. She said all the right things to the investment partners, but not one of them looked at her with the same respect as before. Once the lobby finally cleared, she retreated to her private office and shut the door. She stared through the glass at the harbor below, seeing absolutely nothing. Over the next few days, she did something she almost never allowed herself to do. She looked up the man she had judged so harshly. It did not take long. His name was right on the building's foundation plaque, etched in bronze she had passed 1,000 times without ever reading. Old trade articles described him as a rare, once-in-a-generation talent. He was a designer who viewed public spaces as a moral duty rather than a business deal. There were old photos of a younger Graham accepting major awards. He stood beside a smiling woman who appeared in many shots, then suddenly disappeared. She found a brief, clinical obituary detailing the sudden death of his wife, and she saw the painful silence that followed in his career record. A whole decade where a famous architect completely vanished from the industry. He had not failed, nor had he faced any public disgrace. He simply chose to disappear, trading a famous name for a quiet life nobody would notice. And he was completely happy there, until a proud young executive looked at his muddy boots and decided he did not belong in the very building he designed. Amelia had spent her whole life making sure she was never the one being looked down upon. She had trained herself to detect the slightest judgment, to catch it in a single glance and shut it down before it hurt. But now a sickening realization hit her: she had become the exact monster. The very bully she had spent her entire life fearing. She had stood in that marble lobby and judged his worth solely by the clothes he wore, failing to see who he truly was. Now she faced a critical choice, and she knew exactly what she had to do. She could let the mistake fade. She could blame the busy morning and the intense pressure of the signing, or just the bad luck of an unexpected visitor. Richard was already whispering those exact excuses to her in the hallway, insisting these things happen, and no important person would remember it by next quarter. Claiming a busy CEO could never be expected to recognize every single face. The easy mask of corporate arrogance was right there to pick up. All she had to do was wear it, or she could choose the harder path. She could admit the truth, not to the board or the press, but to herself and then to him. That she had judged his worth by his clothes, blind to the sacrifices that made him who he was. That confession terrified her far more than any high-stakes board meeting, forcing her to confront the ugly part of herself she spent years avoiding. For 2 days she did absolutely nothing. Living with that guilt felt like a slow, painful suffocation. By the third morning she canceled her entire schedule. You and I know she couldn't tell Richard, because deep down, she already understood the truth. He would only want to manage this crisis, but she refused to let him. She needed to face this alone. She eventually tracked down the print shop, a modest brick storefront near the harbor. Its windows were dim beneath a simple hand-painted sign. It looked nothing like the grand tower he had designed. It was just a worn, humble shop with zero pretension. Strangely, that modesty made it much harder for her to approach. Having sacrificed so much to escape a life like this, she thought she'd feel superior standing there. Instead, she felt completely exposed, as if the shop saw right through her expensive designer coat. Inside, Graham was working at a large table when the doorbell chimed. His sleeves were rolled up, hands resting on some blueprints. He looked up, knew exactly who she was, and didn't blink. Maybe he knew she'd return. Either way, he offered no seat, no warm greeting. He just stood there, completely unhurried. Possessing the same quiet dignity from the lobby, he let her find her own words. "I came to apologize," Amelia said, her voice stripped of the corporate armor she usually wore. "What I said to you in the lobby was wrong. I honestly had no idea who you were." "That is the part that doesn't matter," Graham replied. His voice was gentle. "You didn't know who I was. So you assumed I was nobody worth your kindness. Those are two very different mistakes." The truth of his words cut deep, stripping away her pride. She had expected an easy path to forgiveness. To have him dismiss it, the way wealthy people always brush off uncomfortable things. Instead, he exposed her shallow judgment, laying her real character bare on the table between them. He wasn't even angry, and that is what made it so unbearable. You can fight back against a man's rage. But his quiet dignity forced her to confront her own ugly actions. She had no clever corporate excuse ready, and for once she didn't try to find one. There she stood, a wealthy executive clad in a coat worth more than the very table he worked on. Let's pause here, because for the first time in years she finally let herself feel. She realized she had deeply wounded this man, and had nothing to offer him but her raw, honest regret. "You are right," she whispered. "It is not the same mistake, and I cannot ask you to overlook my arrogance. I just needed you to know that I finally see the difference." Graham looked closely at her, and something deep in his eyes began to soften. It wasn't warmth exactly, but it was a quiet realization that she was far more than just the shallow woman from the lobby. He didn't tell her everything was fine, because it definitely wasn't. And they both knew he was a man who only spoke the absolute truth. Instead, he gave her that same single nod he had given her back in the lobby. But this time it felt like the start of something real, not the end. She turned and quietly left the shop. Outside, the old harbor was bathed in that same tired golden light, spilling over the ancient warehouses and dark water. And on the woman standing there, no longer sure, for the first time in years, of who she was actually meant to be. She had walked in so confident of her power, only to leave stripped of her grand illusions. And deep down, beneath all that sudden fear was something almost too quiet to catch, the unfamiliar feeling of finally being honest. But as you and I know, a cheap apology doesn't fix deep arrogance, which utterly shocked Amelia. She assumed that just saying the words would balance the books, like paying off a simple debt. Instead, she carried that heavy realization back downtown, and it weighed heavily on her mind all week, stubbornly refusing to be brushed away. As for Graham, he simply returned to his blueprints, expecting absolutely nothing more. He had looked right through her expensive exterior and found a rare spark of honesty. But a moment of honesty is not trust. And he had built this simple life specifically to avoid the shallow crowd in glass towers. He assumed his quiet life was safe, but the powerful Leonard Sterling had other plans. A week after that lobby scene, the billionaire himself walked right into the print shop. He sat down on the only dusty stool, leaned his cane against the desk, and laid out exactly what he needed. The city had finally cleared the massive renovation of the historic waterfront. A row of beautiful, historic 19th-century warehouses left to decay for an entire generation. Sterling's firm won the contract, but Leonard wanted Graham to guide the design. "I have plenty of high-priced architects," Leonard said. "What I lack is someone who will fight to keep it human. And you used to do that better than anyone. The harbor deserves it, and so do I, before I'm done." Graham studied the powerful old man in silence before answering. You see, that harbor held sacred sacrifices he never spoke about. His late wife had adored those buildings. They had walked there decades ago, when they were completely broke but rich with dreams. And the thought of some shallow developer flattening those precious memories into sterile luxury had quietly tortured him for years. Though he never acted, Leonard had successfully found the one project Graham could never turn down. "I will do it," Graham finally muttered. "Under two conditions: I must remain completely invisible. No press coverage, no public photos, and no name on any plaque. And keep me out of your messy corporate affairs. All the toxic politics and endless meetings. I only consult on the architecture, nothing else." Leonard agreed instantly, no questions. So they shook hands, finalizing a massive deal in a dusty shop far from superficial cameras. Yet both men knew exactly what lay ahead. This historic renovation belonged directly to the Southern Division, which meant Graham would be working daily with the very woman who had deemed him completely worthless. Amelia received the news straight from Leonard's office, rather than from Richard, a detail she deeply noted. She stepped up to lead the massive harbor project as division head. And Graham, a modest-looking man of deep sacrifice, reported his design ideas directly. Working this closely together felt almost too painful to endure. The unpretentious man she once publicly dismissed was now her daily partner. She couldn't reject his expertise without revealing the deep insecurity she desperately hid. Their first weeks together were incredibly tense and cautious. They worked in a raw, simple waterfront office, surrounded by design blueprints, keeping every conversation strictly limited to the project itself. Graham was rigorous, highly demanding, and completely refused to flatter her. He flatly rejected their first plans, calling them costly ways of erasing local history. His calm authority was so undeniable that Amelia agreed before she could even defend her team's work. She fully expected to hate him. Instead, working beside this unpretentious man revealed how little of her high-level status possessed actual, hard-earned substance. In executive meetings, she survived through fast talk and false confidence, never allowing a single quiet moment for anyone to doubt her worth. But Graham saw right through that. He welcomed silence, answering her sharp attacks with deeper questions. Gradually defying all her old habits, she started to crave this humble man's respect. That vulnerability terrified her more than any aggressive corporate board. A powerful unspoken connection grew between them, stretching far beyond their professional duties. Working late together, they both felt a deep awareness they refused to openly acknowledge. A spark born from the quiet intimacy of two guarded souls facing the same struggle. She convinced herself it was merely professional respect. He claimed it was just the project, yet both were lying to themselves. Meanwhile, the ambitious Richard Vale watched their partnership with bitter resentment. He assumed that public humiliation would have shattered Amelia's high standing, forcing her to rely on him to navigate the media fallout. Instead, it pushed her closer to the one simple man the chairman truly loved. He noticed how deeply the chairman respected Graham's humble, quiet wisdom, and how this massive development had been handed directly to the two of them. With 19 years of corporate plotting, he knew exactly what this meant. His path to the top executive seat was being silently blocked. He never planned on letting Amelia keep her powerful leadership position for long. He backed her promotion only because he fully expected her to fail. A fall that would easily hand him the executive office he felt entitled to. That public scandal should have ruined her. Seeing it bring her closer to Graham and the chairman's favor was an outcome Richard knew he had to destroy. With cold patience, he began searching for a way to sabotage them. But this difficult project forced Amelia and Graham closer together every single day. Late one night, studying the plans, they stayed long after everyone left, fiercely debating the very soul of the new harbor. Should these waterfront docks remain public, or be locked away for wealthy, exclusive investors? Their debate quickly shifted from architecture to their deepest human values. In that moment, the careful emotional barriers they built finally crumbled away. "You keep fighting for the people who will never afford to live here?" Amelia asked. "Why? You do not owe them anything." "I owe them what any building owes the people who walk past." Graham said, "The chance to feel like they belong in their own city. You should understand that better than anyone, I would think. You did not always own a fancy coat like that." It was not a cruel remark, but it pierced her armor. Looking at him, the expensive, polished shield she showed the world quietly shattered inside that empty office right by the water. "No," she admitted softly, "I did not." Then, without even planning to, she began to open up. She shared stories of growing up in poor neighborhoods, just like the ones they were debating. She spoke of her mother who cleaned houses all day and came home too exhausted to speak. She remembered the deep embarrassment of always wearing the wrong cheap clothes, of always being on the list of families behind on their bills. She described how the rich people treated her. They would look right through her like she was just furniture. Back then, she made a fierce promise that she would never let anyone look down on her again. "So I learned to judge others first," she said. Her quiet voice was completely stripped of its usual corporate coldness. "I figured if I decided they did not matter first, their judgment could never hurt me. And I became incredibly good at it. So good that I judged you in my lobby without a single thought." Her hands lay flat on the desk, mirroring how his looked when she apologized. "I ended up becoming the exact type of person who made me feel worthless. I was just doing it from the other side of the room." Silence filled the office as the dark harbor stretched out beyond the window. Graham did not offer easy comfort because he knew she would see through any polite lie. Instead, he offered her something much more honest. "When people get hurt that badly," he said, they often become the very thing that wounded them. It is the oldest, most common story there is. That pain does not just vanish when it hits you. It just searches for a new home, and the easiest place to hide is in your own hands. Those words deeply resonated within her for a long moment. No one had ever understood her pain or defined her so accurately. The overwhelming relief of finally being truly seen almost made her break down. This was the defining moment of the whole story. The night she stopped acting and let someone see the raw truth of her fears and protective armor. Graham saw the real her, and what he witnessed completely changed how he viewed her. He had judged her as cold in that lobby, assuming she was just another heartless, wealthy person. Now he realized her cold attitude was not from a lack of feeling, but a protective wall built to guard a deeply wounded heart. She was a woman taught that showing softness only invited more pain. He did not excuse her harsh behavior in the lobby, but he stopped judging her polished exterior and finally saw the frightened, hurting person underneath who had been crying out for years. Yet what neither of them realized was that they were not actually alone. But Richard hadn't gone home. Returning for a forgotten file, he spotted the glow from the waterfront office. He lurked in the dark lot, waiting for the two of them to finally step outside together. Standing close, her polished mask completely gone. The architect leaned near her, caught in the soft spill of the entrance light. He couldn't hear their conversation, but he didn't need to. Raising his phone from the shadows of a parked truck nearby, he captured the exact scene he wanted. Two people who looked like far more than just professional colleagues. He knew instantly the power he now held. It didn't matter what they were actually discussing. A raw confession of childhood struggle meant absolutely nothing to a shallow board. But clear images of the young CEO alone at night with her advisor, their clothes casual and unguarded. That visual intimacy was a weapon that didn't need a single ounce of truth. He went home to build his case, plotting with the cold calm of a man seeking revenge. 2 weeks later, the blow landed with official force. Richard delivered a written accusation directly to the board of Sterling Dominion, claiming that Amelia Whitmore had started an inappropriate personal relationship with a project advisor. He claimed she had compromised the entire firm's judgment and exposed them to immense reputational risk before the very investors they desperately needed. He painted himself as a loyal officer, reluctantly acting only to protect the company he loved. He attached the photos, and they performed exactly as he intended. To people quick to judge by appearances, they saw a guilty young executive and an older man after hours. Just the relaxed posture of two people who forgot to be careful. Richard sent them to the board, lecturing them about standards and superficial appearances. Using the very same words he had used to groom Amelia, now weaponized and aimed straight at her throat. See, he taught her to value image. Now he used that shallow illusion to destroy her. The board immediately called an emergency hearing. Amelia received the summons on a cold, gray morning, reading it twice before the reality hit. After endless months fighting for respect, she was about to lose everything, not because she lacked competence or worked any less, but simply because of a cheap, photo-dressed lie. The real tragedy was how they weaponized the most honest night of her life. The only night she shed her armor was twisted into proof of a crime she never committed. When Graham learned of the accusation that same day, his quiet, steady patience shattered for the first time. He had sacrificed so much, asking only to stay far away from their toxic corporate politics. Yet those very politics reached out anyway to drag down the woman beside him. He saw instantly how Richard had used him as the weapon. His simple presence and friendship were twisted into her ruin. That heavy guilt cut far deeper than any superficial insult ever could. The interrogation took place in the grand boardroom at the very top of Sterling Tower. Inside the very walls Graham had built, lit by the lights he had designed. The brutal irony of their silent sacrifice wasn't lost on them. Amelia stepped inside wearing her sharpest suit, her armor, facing a board that only valued fancy clothes, never her years of sacrifice. And now they had a cheap, manufactured excuse to finally push her out. Richard presented his case with the fake sadness of a man pretending to care. He talked about the firm's precious image and keeping their wealthy, shallow investors happy, claiming a leader who looked bad could never be trusted to run things. He let the deceptive photos do the talking. He spoke softly. He didn't need to yell. He had poisoned their minds for months. Now he was just reaping the rewards. But when it was Amelia's turn, she did something none of them expected. She didn't deny the lobby incident. She brought it up first, owning her mistake completely before anyone else could speak. She confessed that she had foolishly judged a man's worth based solely on his cheap clothes. It was her absolute biggest failure as leader, and she was humble enough to admit her shallow mistake out loud. Her raw honesty disarmed the directors who expected a defensive fight. A few of them shifted, suddenly doubting the neat story they had been fed. But on the fake accusations, she refused to back down. She explained clearly that the photos simply showed two dedicated colleagues working late on an assigned company project. There was absolutely no secret romance between them. And she refused to bow her head to a lie, no matter how convincingly they had packaged it. She didn't name Richard yet, because she lacked the evidence to expose him. She simply refused to admit to a lie, letting her firm stance speak for itself. Richard smugly watched her, absolutely convinced he had already won. To him, her defense sounded like the desperate lies of a guilty person. The photos sat on the table while the directors grew increasingly uneasy. He had spent 19 years learning how superficial rooms like this were. Here, looking guilty meant you were guilty. And a young woman with an admitted slip-up and a folder of bad photos had no chance. He let out a small, smug smile, watching his trap finally snap shut. Suddenly, the door at the far end of the room opened, and Leonard Sterling walked in. He wasn't scheduled to be at this meeting. He walked straight to the head of the table, carrying the same quiet authority they had all underestimated weeks ago. And the entire board stood up without even realizing it. He set down his cane, glanced at the photos, then stared at Richard. He spoke to the directors in a voice that demanded absolute silence. He told them this complaint was a lie, reminding them how easily appearances deceive. He explained that this entire setup, the photographs, the suspicious timing, the clever framing, had all been manufactured by the very man who complained. And he hadn't just figured this out this morning. He had been quietly investigating Richard for over a year, long before this project ever started. Long before the lobby incident, ever since the toxic office politics caught his attention. The room froze. Leonard laid out exactly what his private investigation had uncovered. A trail of dirty tricks and fake evidence. A long plot to ruin real leaders who had sacrificed everything just to steal a chair he didn't deserve. Those photos, he said, were just a cheap weapon. Twisting a night of honest sacrifice into a weapon. He looked directly at Richard. "You decided this company belonged to you," Leonard said. "It never did. It belongs to the people walking into these buildings, and how we treat those who seem to have nothing to offer. You forgot that a long time ago." They suspended Richard on the spot, right before the entire board. His 19 years of pride collapsed in a single sentence. He did not even try to resist. With shaking hands, he packed his files and left the room he was once so sure he would rule. Amelia expected a sense of triumph now the truth was out. Her position was secure. The man who tried to ruin her had failed. Yet, standing inside the towering masterpiece designed by the very man she had dismissed, watching the sunlight fall exactly as he had envisioned it, she finally realized her ultimate failure was never about losing her prestigious corporate title. It was that shameful moment in the lobby. You and I know she had judged a man's worth by his clothes, ignoring his sacrifices. And no corporate decision could erase the fact that she had been so blind. The boardroom slowly cleared out after Richard's departure. But Amelia sat alone, watching the light drift across the floor of his creation. She kept her high status. By every superficial standard she once valued, she had won. Yet the victory felt entirely empty, because she now understood that her own shallow judgment was something no board could ever vote to fix. In the following days, she began to see the massive tower in a new light. For a year, she had walked through the lobby, treating it as a mere stage for photo opportunities, a shallow backdrop for her public image. Now she finally saw the masterpiece Graham had built. How the entrant welcomed people instead of making them feel small. The beautiful way the light fell, ensuring that no one, regardless of their cheap clothes, ever felt out of place. His creation was designed to welcome everyone, Yet she had stood in it and told its humble creator he did not belong. She finally brought it up one afternoon at his waterfront office, where they still reviewed the harbor blueprints together. She told him she finally understood his true vision, that he had not built it to show off power, but to erase the distance between ordinary visitors and the wealthy elites who thought they owned everything. "That was always my goal," Graham said quietly. "But whether it works depends on who is standing in that lobby." He did not speak with anger but with simple truth, and she accepted his words with deep humility. Graham maintained his distance in the following weeks, and she respected his space enough not to push. He returned for the sake of the harbor project, not for corporate greed. The ugly scandal only deepened his long weariness. With the toxic world he had walked away from years ago. He was done with empty promises from people wearing expensive suits. He saw how a raw, honest moment could be weaponized by quick judgment. He knew people rarely look past the surface, so he doubted her change was real. Amelia accepted his silence, which was a victory in itself. Before, she would have manipulated him, finding some cheap trick to turn his distance into fake approval. Instead, she simply kept showing up, raw and unpolished. She let her actual work speak louder than any expensive, polished pitch. She realized her biggest challenge was not managing a division or wearing an executive suit. Anyone can wear a fancy suit, crunch numbers, and charm investors. The real struggle, the one she completely failed at when judging him in that lobby, was learning to actually look at a real person and seeing their true worth, shedding the superficial armor she had worn since childhood. The massive harbor project consumed her entire focus over the following months. For nearly a year she sacrificed her comfort, pouring herself into the work like never before. She finally abandoned her sterile, high-altitude executive office and started spending every single day down in the mud of the waterfront. She toured the drafty warehouses side by side with the engineers. She learned the names of the bricklayers, seeing their dignity instead of just dusty work clothes. She sat in meetings she once felt too important for, listening to the builders and technical crews. Humbling herself to listen, instead of command, was the greatest transformation of all. The boardroom noticed her shift, though they could not comprehend a leader choosing substance over status. She stopped making flashy, empty speeches. She stopped dressing things up for show, and started building a foundation based on real, honest work. Her workers, who were used to being ignored by wealthy bosses who only valued expensive suits, were finally treated with respect, asked for their expertise, and publicly praised for their hard work. The toxic fear slowly vanished. The deep respect that replaced it was genuine. It could not be bought. She had earned it honestly, one humble daily interaction at a time. Graham observed this quiet transformation silently, but he paid close attention. He saw her standing in the thick mud, wearing simple dirt-covered work boots, the exact kind of practical footwear she had once arrogantly sneered at. He watched her protect public spaces from greedy, wealthy investors who wanted them shut. She used the very same arguments about human dignity he had shared on that fateful night. Her change was completely genuine. His life taught him to distinguish those who merely change their outfits from those who truly transform their souls. And he realized very slowly, despite his natural caution, that she had truly transformed her character. Almost a year later, under a crisp winter sky, the revitalized harbor was finally open to everyone. The historic brick warehouses were proudly preserved, not swept away. Their rugged, simple beauty remained authentic. The harbor was open to everyone, welcoming ordinary citizens to walk freely, regardless of what they wore or could afford. Instantly, it became the most cherished sanctuary the city had built for its people in decades. Even the wealthy, elite investors, who wanted it closed, learned that welcoming everyone holds far greater value than keeping people out. They held a simple celebration, completely free of superficial high society vanity. The grand opening took place on the waterfront, right by the restored warehouses. Leonard Sterling spoke briefly, leaning quietly on his cane. He looked at a crowd of wealthy executives mixed with hard-working tradespeople. Then Amelia stepped up, ready to do something this elite crowd never expected from her. She publicly thanked Graham Cole, the humble genius they all dismissed. She no longer cared about the flashing cameras she once feared so much. Her gratitude was different, not like the usual empty corporate praise. She did not just list his professional achievements and design awards. She thanked him for something much greater. She told them that when she started, she thought respect was about keeping people beneath her, judging them by how they looked. But a man in simple work clothes proved her wrong without raising his voice, showing her how wrong she was. She told them he designed this harbor, but the far more important thing he built was the humble person standing before them now. She was now a far better person than the arrogant executive she used to be. Graham stood quietly at the edge, hidden in the crowd, deliberately staying far away from the cameras and the fancy stage. He had asked Leonard for zero public recognition. Amelia respected his wish in the only way that truly mattered, by speaking the raw truth about his character rather than just handing him an award. He did not offer a fake smile for the flashy cameras. Yet the deep exhaustion in his eyes softened just a little as he stood there. He listened to a person who had once looked down on him, now speaking with absolute honesty and zero performance. He chose to stay with the company entirely on his own terms. Not as some celebrated legend, nor as a name on a shiny plaque. Just a part-time advisor who showed up, only when the project deserved his craft, returning to his humble print shop when it did not. Leonard never demanded anything more, and Amelia never tried to control him again. They realized that to keep a man of his value, you must never force what he does not freely offer. On a cold afternoon weeks after the grand opening, the two of them stood high up in the Sterling Tower, looking through the glass at the busy city and the vast harbor below. The setting sun hit the glass, casting a soft golden glow over the water. It was that familiar, beautiful winter light that always wraps the city at dusk. Below them, the grand lobby Graham built was alive, with crowds flowing freely through the main entrance. Nobody was forced to use the side doors. Amelia watched them quietly before speaking. She asked a deeply personal question, one she would have avoided before, because it offered her no corporate advantage. "Do you believe people can really change?" she murmured. Graham stayed silent for a moment. He looked down at the polished marble floor where a man in dusty work boots was once ordered to use the back door by an elite woman who was absolutely sure she knew his worth based only on his clothes. He quietly reflected on the long road from that blind judgment to this moment, and how little of that progress came from talking, and how much from the quiet, grinding struggle. The hard, invisible sacrifice of deciding to build a better life. "Yes," he finally replied quietly. "When they finally stop judging by appearances and see the human being underneath, that is the entire secret. Most never understand. The few who do are completely transformed from within." She watched the crowd moving restlessly below, through the grand lobby, realizing his words carried a truth far deeper than her simple question. He was speaking in the only honest language he knew, his quiet judgment of her character over their long year of hard work. That she had looked past the surface, a rare change he had witnessed himself. They stood silently at the glass, no more words required. Two guarded souls who had spent a lifetime building walls to protect themselves, watching the busy streets under a tower built to welcome everyone, no matter their status. The dark harbor shimmered just beyond the city lights. The elegant lobby swelled and emptied with wealthy guests. And in that quiet space, both knew their greatest creation that year was not made of steel or stone, but of shared respect and deep, invisible sacrifice. Status might make a person look important. A fancy title, a skyscraper, or a famous name. Those things can easily turn heads and command cheap respect whenever you walk into a crowded room. But none of those superficial things answer the only question that truly defines us. How do you treat someone who has absolutely nothing to offer you? Those with empty pockets, no influence, and nothing but their dignity to show. Amelia learned this painful lesson in a grand lobby right in front of the elite. The very people whose superficial approval she craved. She had judged a father by his dusty boots and ordinary clothes. His worn briefcase told her nothing of his sacrifice, so she instantly dismissed him as a nobody. Yet, the ordinary man she had so quickly dismissed turned out to be the very visionary who built the floor beneath her feet and the walls around her. The warm lighting on her face, and the luxury she thought she owned. But the ultimate truth she took from that project wasn't about design. And it certainly wasn't about status. It is that we must never judge a person's worth by the clothes they wear today. We don't know the silent struggles or the immense sacrifices they made to stand in this room. The humble father ignored today might be the visionary who built the ground we stand on so confidently. The only people who blind themselves to this truth are those too proud of their high status to ever look down and respect the sacrifices of those holding them up.